Thank you, Plea, for inviting me. It looks like Plea is doing some very interesting and exciting work in legal education, and I'm really glad to be part of this effort in your regular seminars and programs. So, what I thought I'll do today is that I'll give a brief introduction and a short presentation on disability rights, and then hopefully open up the discussion to questions and queries and some inputs that you all may have, and we can make it quite interactive. So let me start. So our topic for today is looking at disability rights under the law. And I suggested this topic. Of course, this is a topic that is very close to my heart. I've worked on a lot on it. My book is also on disability rights. And also, this is an issue which I feel not too many people are very familiar with, unless you have a disability or there is someone in your family who has a disability is not something that most people would be quite familiar with. But this is an issue that is very important. If we really want to ensure that persons with disabilities have equal rights, then we have to ensure that wherever we are working, studying, or in our public places, in our public life generally, um, it is accessible for persons with disabilities. Because one issue about disability is very interesting. Any of us can become disabled at any point of time, right? There is no guarantee that what age or accident or any incident can make any of us disabled. And so therefore, disability, we have to look at it as something that is not just affecting a few people, but that can potentially affect or any of us and all of us. And therefore, how do we ensure that persons with disabilities have equal rights and are not excluded in any way? So I'd like to start with a small presentation. It's not a complete one, but it's a very brief presentation. So I'd like to discuss how we look at the rights of persons with disabilities under the law. And there are many different legal frameworks, and I'd like to kind of go through each one of them and kind of go through them in some detail. So first of all, our first framework is looking at the constitutional framework and what kind of protection is provided to persons with disabilities under our constitution. Now, if we look at our constitutional rights under chapters 3 and 4, which is fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy, you don't really find um, such a strong recognition of rights of persons with disabilities. So let me go through these articles one by one. So you have Article 14, which is the guarantee to the right to equality. So this is a general right to equality, which says all persons will be treated equally under the law and will have equal protection of the law. So yes, this can be used for any person if there is any unequal treatment by the government or government authorities. And in some cases, yes, Article 14 has been used certainly for persons with disabilities, especially in government employment when they've been discriminated. And the most common manner in which Article 14 is used is when people with disabilities are not allowed to apply for government jobs. Then we have Article 15. Now, Article 15 is the right against non discrimination. And again, Article 15 just has five grounds on which you can guarantee that you will not be discriminated against. And those grounds are race, sex, caste, religion, and place of birth. Now, disability is not there in Article 15. And this is a big matter of concern because while we can ensure that the state should not discriminate against any person on any of these other grounds like sex or caste, religion, place of birth, there is no inclusion of disability. And perhaps one of the reasons for this was when our constitution was drafted, disability was not seen as a recognized ground for discrimination, for preventing discrimination. Disability rights were not even that strongly articulated. It is only much later that, with the disability rights movement, we have been able to, articulate that people with disabilities should not be discriminated. And so, when our constitution was drafted, it was people with disabilities were seen just as a form of, providing charity and not really seen as rights holders. And that's why Article 15 doesn't have the inclusion of disability. But there is, I would argue, a very big need to include the ground of disability as well. Then we have Article 16, which provides equal opportunity in public employment. And, as many of you might know, I'm assuming most of you are lawyers or law students, all the reservations provisions are there in Article 16, that the state can make special reservations, especially for persons on the ground, of for SC, STs, other backward classes, socially and economically, educationally backward classes. And we had the famous Indira Sawhney case and many other judgments after that, which provided for reservations. And so, therefore, Article 16 is also a fundamental right that can be used to make out the case for reservations for persons with disabilities in public employment. Currently, persons with disabilities are provided reservation in public employment and also reservations in promotions. And there have been a lot of judgments that have gone to the Supreme Court on this issue. Then we have Article 21. Now, Article 21 is the right to life. It's an overarching article, and the right to life has been expanded by the Supreme Court to include many other fundamental rights. Of course, it's a right to life and dignity. It includes the right to health, the right to livelihood, the right to housing and shelter, the right to food. So, the right to life under Article 21 is a big basket of rights, and this certainly would be applicable for all persons with disabilities as well. And then we have Article 21A, which is the right to education. Article 21A has recently been made a fundamental right. It was initially a directive principle. Now it has been made a fundamental right so that the state can guarantee to all children between the ages of 6 to 14 years free and compulsory education. And that certainly includes children with disabilities. And then finally, there is a directive principle under Article 41, which states that the state shall make provisions for ensuring the right to work, education, and public assistance in case of unemployment, old age, sickness, and disablement, and in other cases of undeserved want. So this is Article 41. And, as we can see from even the language of this, disability was just seen as making special provision and providing assistance, to people who are elderly, sick, disabled. Really kind of from a charitable mindset and not really from a rights framework. But in any case, Article 41 is there. So these are the fundamental rights and DPSPs from the Constitution. Let's now move on to, apart from the Constitution, what are the other frameworks and are there any statutes? So, on the statutes, yes, we do have different legislations that cover rights of persons with disabilities. So, we have initially we had a legislation in 1995. This was called the Persons with Disabilities Act. The full form is the Persons with Disabilities Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act. This was actually the first law that was enacted in 95 and brought into force in 96. And this was from a very outdated, I mean, it was an outdated law. It has been repealed and now been replaced with the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. So the old legislation was very much from a medical model of looking at disability, and I'll explain that as we go along. And this was recently replaced by a new law called the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. And similarly, at the same time, there was another legislation called the Mental Health Care Act 2016. And this legislation was brought about really for persons with mental disabilities and some of their special needs. And both these laws were enacted in 2016. Now, what is important to kind of bear in mind is that both these legislations were brought about following the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, this is a very, very important international treaty which India has signed and ratified. And it was this UN convention, I think it was brought about in 2003, if I'm not wrong, which really kind of laid the framework internationally for recognizing rights of persons with disabilities. And following the UN Convention, when the UN Convention was brought into force and when India signed and ratified it, there was a big realization that our old legislation, our 95 law, was really not in conformity with the UN Convention. And therefore, there was a big demand that we bring about a different law. And there was a special committee set up by the government, and then this new law was framed. Okay. So, what I'll do in the next 10-15 minutes is really try and take you through the 2016 Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. Okay. So, let's go through the definitions. How is a person with disability defined? There are different definitions. I'd first like to go into the second definition before I reach the first one. So, 2S, if you can see on my screen. Person with disability. A person with disability under this new law is defined as a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with barriers hinders his full and effective participation in society equally with others. Okay. So, what do we mean by this? And, I'd like to just kind of pause here because I think it's important that we all try and really understand this definition. And I'm happy to take questions perhaps at the end of this on this issue. See, the way that this definition is taken from the UN Convention, which says that a person with disability is someone who has physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with barriers hinders his or her full and equal participation in society. Now, why we have such a definition, or why the UN Convention has such a definition, is that there were two models of looking at disability. The old model, which our old law had, and which even I think socially was the accepted model, was a model known as the medical model. And this model focused only on the medical disability and impairment of a person. And the understanding was that you have a disability because you can't hear, because you are blind, or because you have a some other physical impairment, because your limbs are unable to, you're unable to walk, or you're unable to speak, or, so those are, I mean, the way disability was focusing only on the medical impairment. A new model on which the UN Convention is based actually rejects this medical model and developed a social model, Now, the social model understands disability very differently. The social model understands disability by saying that you have a disability not because you can't hear or you can't walk or you can't speak or you can't see. You have a disability because there are barriers in society which don't allow you to access or participate in society equally. So, for example, let me give you let me just give an example. Now, say I have a physical disability or a locomotor disability by which I use a wheelchair. Now, the social model would say that, well, I have a wheelchair, I use a wheelchair, and if I have to access a building or I have to go to work and my office is in a building which has a ramp or a lift, then it's no problem for me, right? I'm not affected in any way. But if a particular building that I want to access has stairs and does not have a lift or a ramp, then I have a disability because there are barriers, and those barriers are the steps. So, if there were no barriers, if there were no, in the sense that there were ramps or a lift, then I don't have a disability because I can access my society, my workplace equally with others, right? So, the social model looks at disability from a social perspective and says that it is they are the barriers which hinder one's full and effective participation in society. And that's a very interesting way of looking at it. How do we ensure that there aren't any barriers in society that would stop people or would interfere with people affecting having full and equal participation in society? And so that's how the social, and that's why the definition of person with disability is from a social model. Okay, but there's another definition as well in 2R, which is a person with benchmark disability. Now, this definition, let me read it out. It says a person with benchmark disability means a person with not less than 40% of a specified disability, where specified disability has not been defined in measurable terms and includes a person with disability where the specified disability has defined in measurable terms as certified by the certifying authority. Okay, now it's a little confusing, but basically it says a benchmark disability is where a person has 40% of a specified disability. And there are about 19 or 20 specified disabilities under the law. And you need to have 40% of any of those specified disabilities. It could be visual impairment, hearing impairment, locomotor disability, autism. There are a whole range of learning disabilities, etc. There are about 20 of them. And if you have 40% of that, then you're a person with benchmark disability. Now, the reason this is included is this actually is left over from the old legislation. The 1995 Act also had this definition. And this is there because many of the provisions of reservation in employment, those provisions given by the government, like specific reservations, are only for person with benchmark disability. So that if you can show those particular 20 disabilities you have 40%, then you are eligible for reservations. So to that extent, some provisions of the law are only for persons with benchmark disability. And finally, I'd like to look at the definition of reasonable accommodation. Now, reasonable accommodation is a very, very important concept when it comes to the rights of persons with disabilities. Reasonable accommodation, I'll read out, means necessary and appropriate modifications and adjustments without imposing a disproportionate or undue burden in a particular case to ensure to persons with disabilities the exercise or enjoyment of rights equally with others. Now, what reasonable accommodation means is that you may need to take some necessary adjustment or modification to provide to persons with disabilities so that they can exercise their rights equally with others. What could be an example of this? An example of this, say, in a school, if there is a person with a learning disability, a child with learning disability. Then you may need an additional teacher, or the regular class teacher may need to have some training to ensure that the child who has learning disabilities, or some modification in curriculum so that the child with learning disabilities can give the examination in a different way, or can have a curriculum that is slightly modified. So, for example, if a child has dysgraphia, which is a learning disability which where the child looks at numbers, some numbers in a different way, then you can, if the teacher is aware of it, the teacher will not mark the child, will grade the child knowing that the child has this learning disability. So it could be an example where at a workplace a person with blindness needs a software on their computer, which is a reading software, so that he or she can do their work on the computer just like anyone else. And so the employer may need to provide that reading software, right? So that is a reasonable accommodation. It's not going to cost that much, but it is a necessary requirement that a person can take to ensure that the person with disability is equally placed with others. Okay. So what the 2016 legislation does is that it provides a whole basket of rights, and I will just go through these quite briefly, and maybe we can have a bigger discussion when we come to the Q&A. So the right to equality, first of all, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, first of all, guarantees the right to equality and non-discrimination to all persons with disabilities. It says that the government shall ensure that persons with disabilities enjoy the right to equality, life with dignity, and respect for his or her integrity equally with others, and that the government shall take necessary steps to ensure reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities. Then there are very specific rights for certain issues. So, for example, there are rights for women and children with disabilities to ensure that women and children are not deprived of their rights. And this is because women and children with disabilities are far more vulnerable than men with disabilities, and therefore to ensure that their rights are protected. So, for example, specifically for women, reproductive rights of women with disabilities will be ensured. Um, I think some of you may be aware that there was a case in the 80s. I think it was a Sheila Barsey case, if I'm not wrong, where a lot of women in a mental health institution, were all forcibly sterilized. And so, and at that time it was thought that it was completely fine to do that, and then the Supreme Court came down heavily. But now this legislation recognizes that they are more vulnerable to their reproductive rights being taken away, and to ensure that this does not happen. There is a guarantee to the right to live in community, and to ensure that persons with disabilities have the right to live in the community. So it could be in the community with their families, and they're not obliged to live in any particular living arrangement. So by that, it's mainly like they cannot be forcibly taken away to an institution or a government home or any other living arrangement which they may not want. Then protection from cruelty and inhuman treatment, the right to protection from abuse, violence, and exploitation, the right to protection and safety, to ensure that persons with disabilities have equal protection and safety in situations of risk, armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and natural disasters. Yeah. And we are looking right now at COVID. In the COVID situation, it's a natural disaster or an emergency, and we find that persons with disabilities are in fact at higher risk. And what are the higher guarantees and protection of rights that have been given to them by the government? And actually, they've not been given those additional rights. Then access to voting, to ensure that they're able to vote in an accessible manner, and access to justice. Okay. Yeah, right to legal capacity. Now, this is again a very, very big right, which is given in the new law. And this is again a little different concept. The right to recognition of legal capacity has been included. It's a big provision in the UN Convention, and that's where it's taken from. And one of the main reasons is that it was always assumed that persons with disabilities cannot take decisions on their own. They don't have the legal, their legal capacity cannot be recognized. So if people can enter into contracts, there were provisions which say that if you have a disability, you cannot even sign a contract. It was assumed that you don't have the capacity to understand or take decisions for yourself. And to address that, because this goes to the inherent autonomy of a person, right? This to address that, this right is there in the Act. It says that the government shall ensure that persons with disabilities have the right equally with others to own or inherit property, movable or immovable, control their financial affairs, and have access to bank loans, mortgages, and other forms of financial credit. So they will have access to all of that. Persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life and have the right to equal recognition everywhere as any other person before the law. Now, there is a provision that they can appoint a person to provide support, and a limited guardian can be appointed. Now, let me just explain that. One is, of course, the recognition that persons with disabilities have the legal capacity like everyone else. But secondly, there is also a provision that a person with disabilities, where he or she may need some support, say, for example, they want to appoint a power of attorney holder to sign some, to take some decisions for them where they feel that they need support. So one can appoint a person, it could be a power of attorney for a limited purpose. Say, for example, they need some assistance in selling some property or whatever. You can say, I'm appointing so and so to provide support as a power of attorney holder just for this purpose. There is also a provision under the law for a limited guardian to be appointed. Now, usually we had this other law which has now been repealed. It was called the Mental Health Act of 1987, in which for all persons with disabilities, family members could go to the court and appoint a legal guardian. And then that legal guardian would be the guardian of that person and property. And basically, all rights of that person are completely taken away, even if that person is fully able to decide for herself. So the law now changes this kind of status. And what it provides for is that if at any point a person with disability needs any assistance on any issue or on any transaction, then the court can appoint a limited guardian. And what is a limited guardian? A limited guardian is a guardian who is appointed, not like a permanent guardian to just say, you're the guardian of so and so person's properties. No, a guardian is just who can be appointed just for, it could just be for one transaction. So supposing there is a particular transaction to be done which is with regard to, say, one property. The court can say that this guardian will be a limited guardian just for this. And so to ensure that ultimately the legal capacity rests with the individual person and he or she can decide to take the support of someone else for limited requirements. Okay. Now, so these are some of the crucial rights. Of course, in addition to this, the two other big chunks are, the right to education and the right to employment. And what the law provides is that all government, I didn't have too much time to go into that, but yeah. So the right to education under the law provides that the government and local authorities shall ensure that all education institutions which are funded by the government will provide inclusive education to children with disabilities. And this would include admitting them without discrimination, making sure that they have full access to sports, recreation, and all activities equally with others, to ensure that buildings, campuses, and facilities are accessible, there's reasonable accommodation provided, there will be support on the academic inclusion, modes of communication in teaching. I spoke about learning disabilities, so to ensure that they detect specific learning disabilities in children and take suitable pedagogical and other measures to overcome them, and monitor the progress and participation of children with disabilities along with other children, and provide them all other support, including transport, attendance, etc. Now, all these provisions are very, very important, and there is an obligation on the government to provide this. What is, and in fact, there are provisions which ensure that in higher education, the government reserve certain seats for students with disabilities in higher education. The big challenge is that this doesn't cover private schools. And so, while all these obligations are there on the government or government funded institutions, we see today that a lot of private schools don't provide such reasonable accommodation measures. Often, buildings and campuses are not fully accessible. And if parents of children with disabilities, ask teachers and managements to make provisions, often we find that the parents are told, well, you can take children and leave and go to any other school. So this becomes very, very difficult. And finally, there is right to employment. What the Act provides is that in all public employment, the government will reserve 4% of posts for persons with disabilities. There will also be reservations in promotions, and there will be provision that if a person gets disability during work, then that person cannot be terminated and should be provided some other employment at the same pay scale and at the same levels. And finally, in addition to the general provisions of employment, the Act also requires that in all schemes and welfare measures, such as, for example, when the government bodies like provide sites or housing or employment, all other benefits and welfare measures, there will be reservations for persons with disabilities, and especially for women with disabilities, so that they have access to welfare schemes, employment schemes, land, sites, and all other kind of special programs and benefits and measures from the government. So yes, so all these, so this law in fact covers all of these provisions. Of course, there's a big problem in the effective implementation of the law. I mean, of course, there are other provisions. Sorry, a couple of more provisions I kind of didn't highlight, is that there are provisions relating to access to transport, public transport. So, for example, buses, trains, flights, all of those should be accessible to persons with disabilities and persons with different disabilities. So, for example, at signals, I mean, if any of you have traveled abroad, you'll see that all traffic signals in many of the Western countries all have not just the lights but audio signals, right? And those are really for persons with blindness and low vision who can't see traffic lights to know when to cross. There are also zebra crossings which are raised so that persons with blindness who have a stick can make out where they are able to cross and where they shouldn't cross. So to ensure that all of these, public roads and transport are accessible, have buses with low floors and all of that. But today we see in our cities that is hardly being done. And that is because the legal provisions under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act has a caveat that this will be done to the extent of the economic, capacity of the government. And so this is still not being done. There was a case where a very well-known activist, disability rights activist, I think was boarding Jet Airways or a Spice Jet flight, and she had a ticket, and she was, not allowed to board the flight. She was going for a conference, and she was asked to get down and was not allowed to take the flight, and only because she had a disability, and the staff said, well, we can't allow you to fly, which is quite ridiculous. And then it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gave a very, very strong judgment that this goes against the rights of persons with disabilities, and in fact asked the airline to give her a compensation of 10 lakhs. So many of these provisions are not yet being implemented. So while we say that on the one hand you have the government obligations, I think what is important is that how do we understand these provisions, and how do we ensure that in our circles, whether it is at work, at university, in our public places, in all our interactions, we ensure that we make many of these places as inclusive, and how do we ensure that we play our part in ensuring that rights of persons with disabilities are fulfilled and guaranteed to the biggest extent that we can. So yeah, I'd like to end here. Thank you.
In your view, what are the lacuna in the existing law that still need to be covered? And are Indian disability laws on par with international ones?
Yeah, one of the biggest lacuna I feel is that this legislation, though it's quite broad and expansive, it to a large extent covers still only the government and does not cover the private sector. It covers the private sector only to a small extent, only in some provisions, but it doesn't cover the private sector completely. And that is the biggest lacuna. So, for example, like I spoke about during the in the education section, it does all the requirements to make education accessible is not imposed on private education institutions, and we know that in India a large bulk of institutions are all private. Similarly, with private employment, there's no mandatory requirement that private employers should provide reasonable accommodation and should not discriminate against persons with disabilities. So, unless it fully covers the private sector, it will still be a limited law. And that is where most of the laws in many other jurisdictions, which are very, very progressive on disability rights, they do cover the private sector.
Jayna, could you talk about some of the cases that you've dealt with in disability laws and any impact they made?
Yeah, so most of the cases, because this is only covering the government, most cases ultimately which go to court are cases by persons with disabilities against the government, because that's what you can do.
Mm.
And most of them are for persons who've been, not able to apply for government jobs, and most of those are that. But I had actually a very interesting case which is going on right now of
Mhm.
of a woman who was a teacher in a very, very big and established school. It's a very, very well-known chain of schools all over the country, and she was a teacher there. And she didn't have a disability. She was a teacher, and during a very tragic incident, a child in that school was I think that child was really depressed with her exam results, and she tried to commit suicide, the child. So she tried to jump off the school balcony, and this teacher went to save the child. And in trying to save the child, she fell off, and she
Oof.
had a permanent disability. Like, she is now completely has both her legs are like she's paralyzed, and she's on a wheelchair. And the after this incident, the school management just paid for like a small portion of her medical expenses, and actually terminated her employment, and said that, well, you're terminated and you can't work anymore. And then she has been, so we've been suing the school for discriminating her and kind of terminating her only due to her disability, which in fact she got because she was doing her duty as a teacher, in the school. And though she's been saying that she can work, I mean, she's on a wheelchair, and if they provide her transport and they provide her classes which are on the ground floor and she can teach, she can easily work. And she's challenging the termination, the illegal termination, and the school is taking the stand in the High Court that they have no obligations under the Act. And so all the obligations not to terminate someone on account of acquiring a disability at work is only on the government and not on the private sector, So we see, I mean, these are very tragic cases, and very well-known big institutions are not willing to accommodate and take people with disabilities, even though they may have acquired a disability at work.